how does this high-end GTX card get on in 2024? Well, to find out, I've played some games and yeah, it's still pretty good. But before that, let's hear a word from our sponsors. Fifine and the H9 gaming headset, geared towards budget gamers, featuring 50mm audio drivers, a detachable microphone and connections with either 3.5mm or a USB connector. Included with the USB cable is an inline adapter. Here the audio input and output can be controlled, and also included with this there is a mic mute toggle switch, which is a feature I always like to see in a headset. You can game for longer thanks to the cushion padding on both the ear cups and headband, which is adjustable with metal hinges. So for more information, check out the Fifine H9 headset in the description below. And the reason why the 1080 Ti is Nvidia's biggest mistake is simply how good it is. 7 years ago, this graphics card stood head and shoulders above every single gaming GPU, and even higher end models like this Strix card were even faster than the Titan XP, which is pretty wild. And it also goes toe to toe with modern budget graphics cards like the RTX 4060. Yes, it will be slightly behind in terms of performance, and it doesn't have the efficiency or the new technologies like DLSS and ray tracing, but it does have 11GB of VRAM and it's got more memory bandwidth. And in the day and age of lots of VRAM being used by games, that 11GB does come in handy. And when you pair this with the fact that it costs around $150 on used markets like eBay, and it's got the GOAT status too, a lot of gamers might opt for a 1080 Ti. But to see if the GTX 1080 Ti is truly the GOAT, I've put my old Strix model, which is pretty tired now, like the fan bearings are starting to go on one of the fans, but it's still holding up. I've tested it at both 1080p and 1440p today, as 4K was kind of out of the question judging from the 1440p results, as from what we're going to see. But all testing has been done in my testing PC, which has a Ryzen 5 7600, 32GB of CL32 6200MHz DDR5 memory, a Western Digital SN770 NVMe Gen 4 SSD, and an MSI X670E Tomahawk. I've raised the power limit to 120% as I think most gamers who are going to buy 1080 Ti aren't really going to care about power consumption, and the driver version is 560.70. With that being said, let's get into it. Full HD is definitely the sweet spot for the 1080 Ti in Cyberpunk 2077. Getting north of 70 FPS here is brilliant performance on the high preset in my opinion. Where you will start to struggle is 1440p. The average frame rate will drop below 60 FPS, but with some settings tweaking, you can get that to be above 60 FPS easily. So overall, in Cyberpunk 2077, the 1080 Ti is doing a decent job here. In terms of optimization, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is not optimized very well, but even at full HD, the 1080 Ti gets north of 60 FPS with the medium preset and ultra textures. Where you will start to struggle, like Cyberpunk, is 1440p, and I suspect without enabling FSR, getting this frame rate to be above 60 frames per second is going to be quite difficult. Hogwarts Legacy is up next, and yet again at 1080p, really good performance here, getting way above 60 frames per second. 1440p, however, on the high preset is a bit of a struggle, not getting quite that 60 frames per second sweet spot, but I suspect, yet again, just like with Cyberpunk, if you were to do a few settings tweaking and leave those textures on ultra, you will be perfectly fine in this game. So the 1080 Ti here, really good performance in my opinion. Across the board at both 1080p and 1440p, performance in Fortnite is very competitive. For full HD, you're set for around a 360Hz gaming experience on the DirectX 11 API, and even if you wanted some more clarity at 1440p, a 240Hz experience here is totally viable. As long as you've got a decent CPU to pair with the 1080 Ti, you're good to go for a competitive experience in Fortnite. Flipping that on its head though with Starfield, and yeah, the performance across both resolutions isn't great today. But if you're cool with sort of a 30 FPS experience, 1440p is still playable I suppose, and then 1080p didn't even see that much performance over Quad HD, so yes, Starfield just simply isn't really that optimised for this graphics card. Where this trend continues is Forza Motorsport, just to a lesser degree. It does seem that this game isn't really optimised for Pascal graphics cards, as 68 FPS at 1080p isn't really great performance, and this even drops below 60 frames per second at Quad HD. So Forza Motorsport, it's playable on a 1080 Ti, particularly at Full HD, but it's not great performance in my opinion, particularly for a racing game. But we're ending off on a high here with the high preset in Spider-Man Remastered. The 1080 Ti at Full HD will get in the high double digits, and then at 1440p you're still getting a hefty amount of performance over 60 frames per second. Perhaps for Full HD you could get away with a very high preset. For 1440p, keep it with the high preset. It still looks really good in my opinion. And this performance is why this Pascal beast is the greatest GPU of all time. 7 years on and it's still getting great performance even at, well, a resolution like 1080p. It's not the highest resolution, but when you bear all things in mind, even unoptimized games like Jedi Survivor and Starfield, where the latter is the only game to get less than an average of 60 frames per second at Full HD, which in my opinion seals this GPU as one of the greatest of all time. And thanks to the 11GB of GDDR5X, you won't be running into any VRAM related problems even at 1440p. And because of this, you can always enable ultra or high textures without any issues. With 8GB graphics cards like the RTX 4060 or RX 7600 from AMD, you might start to run into some VRAM related problems at Quad HD. But in this, you can just set it to ultra and you'll have no problems, even if the rest of the settings are like on medium or low. Speaking of the high resolution, Quad HD was kind of rough on the 1080 Ti. Most games which were fine at 1080p did start to struggle at the higher resolution. But I suspect every single game, if you were to do a bit of tweaking, you could get at least 60 frames per second, whether that's doing some settings tweaking or enabling FSR, which technically means the game isn't being rendered at 1440p, but it's better than rendering at native 1080p, I suppose. And of course, thanks to the 11GB of VRAM, you can keep the textures on high or ultra with absolutely zero VRAM related problems. Where you won't need to make compromises is in competitive esports titles. As Fortnite ran really well today, getting a competitive experience at both Quad HD and 1080p, this says to me that other titles like Counter-Strike 2, Rainbow Six Siege, Valorant, Rocket League, these sorts of games will run totally fine on a 1080 Ti, as long as you've got a sensible CPU pairing. So I'd recommend something like the Ryzen 3000 and above for something like a 1080 Ti. Here you'll be getting really good gaming performance. Increasing that performance or system latency is NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. Yes, the 1080 Ti does support this, and even GPUs as old as the 980 Ti will support it, so that's great for you esports gamers out there. Even though Pascal was considered to be quite an efficient architecture, the power consumption of the 1080 Ti is definitely one of its biggest downsides. In my testing today, it consumed around 280 watts. Yes, I did increase the power limit, but this is more than double of something like an RTX 4060. So if you're concerned for your power consumption, the 1080 Ti definitely isn't a GPU for you. Also, if you like modern features like DLSS and ray tracing, you're not going to get that in a 1080 Ti. The closest thing you're going to get to DLSS is FSR. With a ray tracing argument though, it's not really viable on an RTX 4060 anyway, so that's kind of a moot point. But DLSS is definitely a big win for the newer graphics card. So how much longer can the GTX 1080 Ti hold on for? And I suspect until driver support gets dropped. Maxwell hasn't even been dropped by NVIDIA as of yet, and if it doesn't get dropped this year, I suspect in 2025 or maybe even 2026, we'll see both the 900 series and the 10 series lose their driver support, effectively sunsetting the GTX graphics cards from NVIDIA. But as it stands right now, the GTX 1080 Ti still has quite a bit of life left in it, and if you were to buy one of these used or you already own one, you're still going to be getting some decent 1080p performance, and maybe even 1440p performance if you want. And that is why the GTX 1080 Ti is Nvidia's best mistake, for us gamers at least. But if you want to see a bad mistake from Nvidia, there's a graphics card right up there for you. You might want to watch that one. So I'll catch you in the next one. Watch that one if you want to.